So our next lecture, the last great Islamic empires, will be focusing in particular on three empires. The Ottoman Empire, roughly based in terms of the imperial heartland around the modern-day state of Turkey. The Safavid Empire, corresponding more or less to Iran, present-day Iran, and then the Mughal Empire based in India. And so we'll start with the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps in terms of actual territory and power, maybe the greatest of the three. I mentioned kind of at the center is territory roughly corresponding to the modern day state of Turkey. But as you can see from the map on the upper right side, quite a large empire, pretty much including all of what today we consider as constituting the Middle East, a good part of North Africa, and a good part of Southeast Europe. And this empire is actually going to carry on for quite some time, from the late 14th century all the way up to shortly after the First World War in the 20th century. And the name Ottoman Empire is simply referring to the fact that pretty much you're going to have the same ruling dynasty from beginning to end. It essentially means the House of Osman. So it's going to be a dynasty initiated by Osman, meaning for the most part father to son, right up until the early 20th century. It's going to last just to a little bit past the First World War. So Osman I, born in 1258, at that time, what today constitutes Turkey or Anatolia, to use the geographic term, primarily made up of a number of small provinces, for the most part beholden to Mongol overlords. And so Osman is the head of one such beylik who in 1299 declares it independent, establishing his own small kingdom, an Ottoman principality, and very quickly goes on to conquer a number of neighboring Turkish tribes and their beyliks, and with this, the Ottoman Empire is on its way. Eventually, he comes very close to Constantinople, even establishing his new capital directly across the Sea of Marmara from Constantinople at the city of Bursa, today a major city in the Republic of Turkey. But at that point, rather than going on to try and conquer what remained of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans now cross over to Europe, where they begin to conquer territory in southeast Europe. The definitive battle in that regard is the Battle of Kosovo of 1389, which pretty much opens the floodgates to conquering a good chunk of Southeast Europe, effectively surrounding Constantinople. I mean, much of this coming at the expense of what remains of the Byzantine Empire. I should mention the chief adversary during this battle is going to be the Serbians. And even until today, for many Serbs, this battle, the Battle of Kosovo 1389, kind of a defining moment in their sense of, historically who they are as a people. So it's kind of worth noting that. If you ever run into anyone who is Serbian, it's pretty much guaranteed that they, have a lot to say about this particular battle. In any event, at some point, the Byzantine Empire has really shrunk down to just a small amount of territory around the city of Constantinople, maybe a few other territories, and is completely surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. And, looking back now with kind of historical hindsight, it seems pretty inevitable that at some point, the Ottoman are going to go after Constantinople. It obviously lends itself to being the capital of this new empire. It's very centrally located. It's kind of hard to imagine they're accepting this small kind of independent empire. And you almost can hardly call it an empire at this point, but it should be smack in the middle of theirs. But nonetheless, I mean, it's still not an easy thing to take the city. It's very famous at this point for its formidable defensive walls that are very hard to breach. And it's surrounded by the sea on three sides. So it's still a difficult undertaking. But eventually, one of the Ottoman sultans is going to manage to take the city. And that would be Mehmet II, who conquers Constantinople on May 29th, 1453. And by the way, that is a date I expect you to remember. It's just one of those really monumental dates in human history. I should note, I mean, this event, the fall of Constantinople, marking also the end of the Byzantine Empire, is going to reverberate throughout Europe, and is seen as kind of a sign of impending doom of the end times. You name it. I mean, people are really freaking out. But in any event, it now becomes the capital of the Ottoman Empire. I should also make note that part of the reason the Ottoman are able to take the city is that they have learned how to really utilize gunpowder militarily. And one of the first empires to really use gunpowder militarily on a large scale. Invented in China, but until then used primarily for fireworks. And maybe minimally militarily. Here they're creating these massive cannons that really help them to breach the walls. So now the capital of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman are not done expanding. They will continue to do so under Selim I, who ruled from 1512 to 1520. Always loved his nicknames, the Grim or the Brave, apparently a reputation of not someone, shall we say, overly inclined to laughter. Under him, the Mamluk Sultanate will come to an end in 1517. Which also means that at that point the Ottoman bring the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina under their control. And from this point on, they're really going to promote the idea that they are the defenders of Sunni Islam. And responsible for the Hajj, for preserving the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. So using Islam as a way to legitimize their rule. Related to this, they take the title of Caliph. It's not something they really, a title they try to take much advantage of. It really is kind of a symbolic thing. They're never going to assert, for instance, any kind of religious authority connected with that. And as a further indication of the symbolic nature of this, they claim also the emblems of the caliphate, the sword and mantle of Muhammad, which will come to be housed in Constantinople in the Pavilion of the Holy Mantle. Here we see the mantle of Muhammad. And over here, the sword of Muhammad. These are what we call religious relics. So, kind of certain ideas develop about their having certain holy qualities because, in this case, of their connection with Muhammad. You have the same basic ideas in other religions, most notably in Christianity. Anything associated with the life of Jesus, for instance, might be perceived as having a kind of holy quality or things associated with certain saints. So, kind of like that. But again, a lot of this is really kind of political, kind of a way of legitimizing the Ottoman right to rule as defenders of, and we might say at this point, Sunni Islam, because around this time we're going to see a great Shiite empire emerge in roughly what corresponds to Iran, and that would be the Safavid Empire, which we will talk about in a bit more detail momentarily. The first major confrontation between these two empires will be the Battle of Chaldiran, which ends with a decisive victory for the Ottoman Empire. This takes place in 1514, after which the Ottomans are able to consolidate their control over all of Anatolia, what roughly corresponds to modern-day Turkey. And so it does also kind of mark the defining border, not just between these two empires, but to some degree between the Sunni and Shiite worlds, and later on between kind of corresponding to the modern-day borders between Turkey and Iran. Part of the reason the Ottomans were so successful is they simply had a larger, better equipped army, about 200,000 versus 50 to 80,000. And they had really, in terms of technology, had gone far ahead in the development of firearms using gunpowder, something that the Safavids had not really taken advantage of until then. And all of this proved to be decisive. But in some ways, these two now become kind of the superpowers of the Middle East, right? The one representing Sunni Islam, the other one Shiite Islam. The high point of the Ottoman Empire probably comes under Suleiman the Magnificent, during which time the Ottoman Empire will continue to expand. Under him, they capture Belgrade in Europe in 1521, go on to defeat the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs 5 years later, bringing much of what today constitutes Hungary under Ottoman control, and even at some point laying siege to Vienna in 1529. And that was a pretty scary moment for Europe, right? I mean, there really was this kind of feeling that if Vienna were to fall, it would open the floodgates to the infidel and they would overrun the entirety of Europe. In the end, they didn't take Vienna. And some historians looking back would argue that there's just kind of a point where you're moving too far away from the center in order to maintain control of territory. And then there's also the whole problem of maintaining supply lines to the army and so forth. Particularly back in the day, you would fight campaigns during the summer, and if you weren't able to conquer something by the winter, you basically went home. But they don't take Vienna. They also continue to expand to the east, taking Baghdad from the Safavids in 1535. And just for fun, I thought I'd put up next to the photo of Suleiman, his favorite wife, Roxolana, who is, by the way, buried next to him, even though she might have convinced him to kill his eldest son. It's kind of one of these kind of palace intrigue kind of stories. But she was, apparently considered to be very beautiful, very charming, probably of either Russian or Ukrainian extract. But again, if you were to visit his tomb, you'd find her buried next door. And here we see the expansion of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman. So this is pretty much the Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent, including much of Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This map is kind of color-coded to indicate when different parts of the empire were brought under Ottoman control. And here we see a European artistic depiction of the Siege of Vienna in 1529, just kind of an indication of how significant an event this was considered to be from a European perspective. At this point, I'd like to consider some of the factors underlying the success of the Ottoman Empire. And by pretty much any measure, it was a very successful empire, whether in terms of longevity or the vastness of the territory that it brought under its control. So probably the key factor was a kind of flexibility, and this was especially evident with respect to Ottoman administration. If it worked, they were quite happy to adopt it. So you end up with a blend of influences, beginning, of course, with their own Turkish nomadic heritage, but then as they brought various territories under their control, pretty much adopting different practices as they encountered them, and that would include Byzantine, but also, of course, Islamic practices. They were famous for utilizing the talents of all its people and a willingness to adopt the administrative practices of these various peoples they conquered. So that meant not only maintaining administrative institutions that they encountered, leaving them in place, but very often keeping the same personnel in place, regardless of ethnicity or religion. So you have in many areas large numbers of Christians that are in important positions administratively. And they would, of course, develop certain practices common to the empire as a whole. Maybe most important was the development of a common language of administration, Ottoman Turkish, which really has to be distinguished from present-day Turkish, what they speak in the modern state of Turkey. For one thing, Ottoman Turkish was written in Arabic script. Modern-day Turkish, the modern Turkish language is written using Latin letters. Ottoman Turkish also borrowed heavily from Arabic and Persian, not just in terms of vocabulary, but also grammatically. Now, one other clear indication of flexibility had to do with the position of sultan. Of course, the sultan was at the top of the political hierarchy, but very often when they conquered different territories, they would adopt different titles reflective of different kinds of relationships with different subject populations. So in the east, closer to Iran, the title Padishah, which reflects Iranian political traditions, was often used. We already discussed how the sultans at some point adopt the title of caliph as a way of kind of utilizing Islam to legitimize their rule, presenting themselves as defenders of the Sunni faith. I didn't mention when they conquered Constantinople, they also adopted the title of Caesars, kind of a way of demonstrating respect for, up until then, existing Byzantine practices. Now, in theory, the sultans did have both political and religious authority, but much as we discuss with respect to sultans in general, the real religious authority lied with the ulama. And so the Sultan very much respected that fact. They would do things to kind of show their respect for the ulama, patronizing them, providing funding for the building of mosques and schools and so forth. And the ulama in return would acknowledge the authority of the Sultan. Now, with respect to the succession, we find, at least early on, something not unlike what we saw with the Ayyubids, right? So there might be a number of different claimants to the throne. Usually it would be the sons of the previous sultan. In anticipation of the eventual struggle for succession, all the sons would be highly trained, very often given important positions in government, in order to prepare them to eventually govern, but also as a way of eliminating those physically or mentally unfit, something that would become very readily apparent by virtue of giving them responsibility. When the Sultan finally died, his sons would fight it out for the Sultanate, with the winner then executing all other potential pretenders to the throne. And I know that might seem pretty harsh, but that really could avoid a host of problems down the road. Later on, they would kind of drop that practice of executing the Sultan executing his siblings. Rather, they would consign them to the harem, where they could while away the rest of their days rather pleasurably, but completely cut off from any connection with government. Now, the Sultan, of course, had ultimate authority, but they were advised by a council of ministers known as the Divan. The ministers were known as viziers, and usually there would be one very important vizier, the highest ranking one, known as the Grand Vizier. And later on, like for a long time, up at least until Suleiman the Magnificent, you have really strong, charismatic sultans who really, directly wield power. Later on, that will become less frequently the case, and you might actually have a situation where the viziers are pretty much kind of governing the empire on behalf of the sultans. And there could even be other individuals that might exercise a great deal of influence and even some degree of authority. This was especially apparent with the harem, the private chambers of the Sultan, where he and his family members, when he was off duty, where he resided. Harem often in kind of the popular Western conception, filled with women devoted to the pleasure of the Sultan. There is some element of truth to this, but it's really more about it being kind of his personal chambers where he can let his hair down. And related to that, right? I mean, this is, individuals occupying the harem would have had a kind of unique, much more personal access to the Sultan, and therefore, by extension, potentially greater influence. And this was especially true with respect to the mother of the Sultan. The Valide Sultan would have been a highly respected figure, and age and the fact of being a parent would have conferred upon them tremendous respect on behalf of the Sultan. And so they had tremendous influence. This really became apparent during the late 16th and 17th centuries, a period that historians sometimes refer to as the Sultanate of Women because of that. That might actually be a factor in the eventual decline of the Ottoman Empire, that you had kind of, more weak-minded sultans, more easily influenced by outside individuals. But before we get to that, I wanted to look at one very important example of the flexibility of Ottoman government, and that has to do with something called the millet system. A millet refers to a specific religious community within the Ottoman Empire. The term actually very often can be translated as nation or community, but in this case referring to the different non-Muslim religious communities in the Ottoman Empire. And so the basic idea was that each religious community constituted a separate millet, and these were pretty much allowed to govern themselves autonomously to a really great extent. So long as they paid their taxes and didn't make trouble, they pretty much could govern themselves by their own religious laws, follow their own religious traditions and so forth, and could operate fairly independently. The first proper millet was designated after the conquest of Constantinople, and that was the Orthodox Christian community, which from that point forward was permitted to basically abide by the Justinian Code, which had pretty much been operative within the Ottoman Empire. And so the way this worked is basically the Sultan would designate the head of that religious community, in this case the Millet of Rum, kind of a reference to the Roman connection there, would designate the head of that religious community responsible for it as a whole. They became a kind of intermediary between the Sultan and the larger community, very often, for instance, collecting taxes from, in this case, Orthodox Christians, and then, kind of sending that along to the Sultan's government. So the first head of the Millet of Rum was the actual patriarch in Constantinople. Another title was ethnarch, and that was Gennadius II Scholarius. And eventually other millets would be designated corresponding to the Armenian Orthodox community, to the Jewish community, even eventually to Protestants, which at this point, well, there are hardly any in Europe, much less the Middle East. Of course, the Ottomans are famous for their military success, hence why they ended up with such a large empire. A number of factors underlying this. We already mentioned that they were the first to take advantage of gunpowder, so a certain kind of technological advancement in that regard. Certainly important with respect to cannons when laying siege to a city, but also in the use of muskets. Something reflective of their kind of Central Asian nomadic heritage, the Timar system. So early on, probably the most important element within the Ottoman army would have been the cavalry. Cavalrymen would serve the Ottoman Sultan in return for a fief, a very large area of land known as a timar. So somewhat similar to what you have in Europe during the Middle Ages, where a noble, a high-ranking knight, would fight on behalf of the king and then be given authority over this large area of land on behalf of the king, or in this case, behalf of the sultan. And finally, they really excelled at certain tactics involving short swords and bows that sometimes gave them a tactical advantage. This again reflected their nomadic heritage. Eventually, they developed a elite fighting force known as the Janissaries that would actually become the terror of Europe. I mean, they were really extremely well-trained, very effective fighters. And in some ways, this fighting force resembles very much the various Mamluk armies that we talked about historically before now. So the way the Janissaries came about, you had a system known as devshirme, a kind of human taxation system. And Christian families within the Ottoman Empire would be required to turn over at least some of their young male children at an early age, who would then be converted to Islam and then trained for various kinds of functions, some to become administrators and so forth within the Ottoman government. But those who showed a potential for kind of military service would be trained to become Janissaries. And so, much like the Mamluks as well, they were perceived as a kind of slave caste devoted to the service of the Sultan, something reflected in the term kapikulu. But in fact, much like the Mamluks, they eventually became extremely powerful. So early on, it was pretty kind of rigid system. If you became a Janissary, you were confined to the barracks. You couldn't become married. You couldn't really intermingle with kind of the locals wherever you were stationed. But that eventually would kind of fall to the wayside. And very often within local communities, they would become extremely important, extremely powerful individuals, eventually taking wives, intermingling, becoming engaged in various kind of business activities and so forth, and very jealous of preserving their status as this kind of elite fighting force. That will eventually become a problem for the Sultan. But they are very effective.
And finally, we should note that the Ottoman had a very powerful navy during the 16th century at least. One figure that really stands out here, a fellow named Barbarossa, at least that's how he was known in Europe, kind of seen as a sort of pirate figure. More properly, Khair al-Din Pasha, the admiral of the Ottoman Navy. Might interest some of you to know that the word admiral in English comes from Arabic, as in Amir al-Bahar, Amir al, eventually becoming admiral. And certainly under him, the Ottoman dominated the Mediterranean, particularly in the eastern part, but eventually all of it. So for instance, at some point they bring an end to the Spanish occupation of Tunis and Algeria. Later on during the Spanish Inquisition, they would play a very important role in evacuating large numbers of Muslims and Jews. Spain was throwing them out, and the Ottoman Empire was like,
You don't want them? We'll take them. Many of them ended up being settled within Ottoman territory. And finally, and I just kind of threw this in there as an example that not everything was about religion even back in the 16th century. So, for instance, 1543, Barbarossa allying himself with the French fleet against the Holy Roman Empire, right? So the two of them united in their opposition to Habsburg Spain. So there you have the greatest Muslim power of the Mediterranean world uniting with a Catholic power against another Catholic power. So most of what we've talked about until now really reflecting kind of the glory days of the Ottoman Empire, but there is one other development and corresponding to the same period, but which eventually will have a very, very negative consequence on the Ottoman Empire. And so I do want to highlight this, definitely extremely important, and that is the capitulations. So, what are the capitulations? They were kind of like trading rights or grants made by successive sultans to Christian nations, basically conferring rights and privileges to their Christian subjects when they were trading in the Ottoman dominions, right? So the basic idea that, for instance, if you were a French merchant operating within the Ottoman Empire, you would have been not subject to Ottoman law and not subject to many Ottoman taxes. And this would have conferred upon you a tremendous advantage with respect to your Ottoman competitors within the empire. Now, initially this was supposed to work in both directions, right? So that Ottoman traders operating in European states would enjoy similar rights and privileges. And so, at the time, it probably seemed like a good idea. The first European power to be granted such rights and privileges was France, in honor of the alliance between Suleiman the Magnificent and the French King Francis I during the mid-16th century in connection with the naval alliance that we just mentioned. And so, initially it really only involved a relatively small number of individuals, but over time it would really become a much, much bigger factor in how European states engage with the Ottoman Empire. You just have kind of an increasing number of European subjects operating in the Ottoman Empire, and really not much happening in the other direction, right? And so it's something that the European powers would eventually abuse to a great extent and would become a mechanism by which they were able to impose themselves, certainly economically, but to some extent also politically on the Ottoman Empire as well. And so that's kind of a story for later on. And indeed, at some point, decline does begin to set in. Of course, it wouldn't really have been apparent at the time, but historians looking back with the benefit of hindsight often date this period of decline as beginning with the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. And that was a pretty decisive Spanish naval victory over the Ottomans. From that point on, Spain will become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. And, again, looking back, it's pretty apparent that, from that point forward, the Ottoman Empire is losing battles more often than it's winning. That doesn't mean that, they weren't perceived as a significant threat. And every now and then, they could really put the fear of God, if you will, into Europe. They were able to lay siege to Vienna again in 1683, this time turned back by an alliance of European kings, if you will, eventually kind of saving the city. But for the most part, from that point forward, it's really kind of a continuing story of, at least militarily, of decline, right? Where they're losing wars, losing territory, and probably the point at which it really became apparent to people in that time, certainly to Ottoman officials, that there is a serious problem here, was with the outcome of the Great Turkish War in 1699, which concluded with the Treaty of Karlowitz, and which saw the Ottomans forced to cede vast amounts of territory, nearly all of Hungary, Transylvania, not going to make any vampire jokes here, and some smaller territories like the Morea and Podolia. And so we're going to come back to this kind of issue of decline of the Ottoman Empire. That really is much more corresponding to the modern period. Before we do that, I'd like now to talk about the Safavid Empire. So the Safavids were the chief rivals of the Ottoman during much of the period that we've been looking at. The Ottoman Empire eventually becoming the dominant Sunni Muslim power in the region, Safavids becoming the dominant Shiite power, and territorially roughly corresponding to modern day Iran, at least what we might call the imperial heartland, very often conquering territories beyond those borders. So they started out as a Sufi order, the Safaviya Sufi order. And we haven't really talked about Sufism. It's not a sect of Islam, but rather reflects certain practices related to mysticism. And related to that, and in this case, it is a Sunni Sufi order, but in connection with this kind of accentuation of mysticism, finding kind of many points of overlap with Shiism, so in some ways kind of facilitating that transition. The Safavids themselves would claim to be descended from the Imam Ali and his wife Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, through the seventh Imam, Musa al-Kazim, though I should note they would ultimately promote Twelver Shiism, right? So kind of, promoting the idea that in terms of legitimizing their right to rule, the dynasty could claim descent from one of the imams. But at the end of the day, promoting this kind of Twelver form of Shiism, which, followed a different line of descent, ending with the 12th Imam, who, as you might recall, was considered to be in a state of occultation or hiding. The rise of the Safavids corresponded to an alliance made between these Sufi mystics and certain Shiite militant groups known as the Qizilbash. And this happened under Sheikh Junaid, the head of the Sufi order, who in a very conscious way sought to transform what was ultimately a religious order into a political power. And so this would be accomplished by forming an alliance with militant groups known as the Qizilbash. This is actually an Ottoman Turkish term meaning redheads and referred to their distinct headwear, probably the most notable feature of which was the 12 points that the hats feature, right? And these would have corresponded to the 12 Shiite imams, right? Hence the fact that they are Twelvers. And with their help, they were eventually able to found the Safavid dynasty. This actually kind of started in roughly what constitutes the northwestern part of Iran and the modern state of Azerbaijan, but eventually they would bring all of what constitutes Iran under their control. Probably the most significant development would be under Ismail I, right, the Shah of Iran from 1501 to 1524, and it's under him that Iran would be transformed from a predominantly Sunni state into a Shiite one. And this would effectively be done by force, right? So, basically it started with the ulama. They were basically compelled to adopt Shiism on pain of death. If they chose not to, they would have to either go into exile or eventually find themselves killed. And so at some point, and it really did happen rather quickly, but at some point the bulk of the ulama had adopted Shiism, and then eventually through them it permeated into the rest of the population. Ismail himself would claim to be descended from the Imam Ali and his wife Fatima, again through the seventh Imam, Musa al-Kazim. And this is where the Safavid dynasty really began to promote this idea of not really being proper imams themselves, but having this kind of connection with respect to the seventh imam. So I think at this point I should say a few words about Shiism. It's not something we're actually covering in the course, but there are two basic major sects in Islam. You have Sunnism, which represents about 90% of Muslims worldwide, and then Shiism, corresponding roughly to the other 10%. And the really probably most famously, Iran is probably the only major Muslim majority state that is predominantly Shiite. Though you do find sizable Shiite populations in places like southern Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, one of the Gulf states in the Middle East, and so forth. So the basic difference between Sunnis and Shiites has to do with following the death of Muhammad. There were some who felt that the successorship ought to have gone to someone related to Muhammad, specifically his son-in-law and cousin Ali. And then following him down the line of descent through Ali, through the bloodline, over successive generations. And there was kind of this idea that because of the blood relationship to Muhammad, that they had almost quasi-mystical powers on the basis of which they would have a perfect understanding of Islam, God's will, and what Muhammad had intended for the community. And they designated these individuals who, in theory, should have had the leadership. They actually never end up having it. Imams. Right? We should be careful here. The term imam is used by Sunni Muslims, simply designates a kind of prayer leader in the mosque. And in fact, Sunnis rejected the idea that the leadership should fall to anyone related to Muhammad, that this somehow conferred upon them any kind of special abilities. Muhammad was the final prophet, what they call the seal of the prophet. Shiites don't dispute that, but for many Sunnis, these imams seemed a bit too much like prophets, kind of carrying on that tradition. But in any event, that is kind of the basis of that schism. Now, among Shiites, there will be divisions about the line of successorship in the imamate, right? Who should be the next imam with each successive generation. We end up with three main groups. So we have fivers who, with the fifth generation, disagreed with the majority of Shiites about the successorship between two brothers, went with a fellow named Zaid, hence sometimes referred to as Zaidis. The majority went with Muhammad ibn al-Bakr. And then again, with the seventh generation, there was disagreement. A minority going with, there were two brothers going with Ismail, hence referred to as Seveners or Ismailis. The majority going with Musa al-Kazim, and it is Musa al-Kazim who the Safavid Shahs claim to be descended from, but they're not imams. The majority would go down the line through Musa al-Kazim up until the 12th imam, al-Muntazir, who is considered to have actually gone into a state of hiding. So he marks the end of the line of imams. After him, there are no imams. He's in a state of occultation. When I say hiding, I mean in a kind of mystical, spiritual sense, and will return at the end of days to pass judgment with the Mahdi. So there is no imam, right? But there's still this kind of idea that the leadership fell to the imam, that the imams had a perfect knowledge of Islam, that in a sense, whatever they decreed represented the will of God. Representing them are the Shiite ulama, sometimes known as mujtahideen. So in a sense, the ulama within Shiism have a bit more flexibility in how they interpret things, the Quran and so forth. This actually becomes a factor with the Iranian Revolution. But it is Twelver Shiism that is ultimately adopted within the Safavid Empire, and that prevails today in Iran. Again, the majority of Muslims being Sunni, the term Sunni referring to the idea that inasmuch as there is no imam to tell them, how to behave as Muslims, they look to the example of the Prophet, his normative behavior, or sunnah, right? Hence the term Sunni, knowable through the hadith, traditions about things that Muhammad said and did that can provide guidance. But within that context, Sunni ulama less flexibility, less authority, in a sense, in terms of innovating, with regard to how to interpret the Hadith, the Quran, and so forth. Kind of the idea that, over a number of generations, a certain understanding of what different things signify in the Quran, the Hadith, had emerged, and you should just really kind of stick with that. So eventually the Safavids have become a major rival to the Ottomans. We already discussed the first major encounter, the Battle of Chaldiran, which took place in 1514 and was a decisive victory of the Ottoman Empire over the Safavids. And again, noting that this would end up kind of defining the border between the two empires, between the kind of Sunni and Shiite worlds within the Middle East, and roughly, kind of corresponding to the border that would eventually emerge between Iraq and Iran. One thing that was clear to the Safavids after their decisive defeat at the hands of the Ottoman is that they needed to reform their military. And this would happen under the individual generally considered to be their greatest ruler, the Shah Abbas I. And by the way, you probably noticed by now that they don't use the title Sultan, rather they use the title Shah, which is kind of an ancient Iranian title that predates Islam. So kind of, reflecting an indigenous Iranian political tradition. In any event, Abbas I took the throne following the forced abdication of his father, Shah Muhammad Khudabanda. And he was known as Abbas the Great, and he's generally considered to be the greatest ruler of the Safavid dynasty. So, as already mentioned, a lot of reform taking place of the military under his rule, and also in an effort to secure the capital, kind of relocating it further to the interior, away from the frontier, at the city of Isfahan. And Isfahan would go on to become this, incredibly beautiful center of, kind of intellectual activity, cultural center. And this is definitely a period when the Safavid Empire is thriving, whether you're talking about culturally, economically, and also politically. And so, if you were a tourist going to Iran today, Isfahan would probably be, destination point number one. As you can see from some of these images, a very beautiful city. We see here Nagsha-e-Jahan Square, Shah Mosque, and so forth. Regarding the military reform, one interesting aspect of this was the part played by two English brothers, travelers and adventurers who just happened to be passing through Persia in 1598 during the rule of Abbas I, and this was Robert and Anthony Shirley. So they end up being hired by the Shah to train the Persian army according to the rules and customs of the English militia. So kind of, introducing some, for that time, modern developments that were then taking place in Europe. Among other things, this would include the introduction of gunpowder on a much grander scale, right? Something that had given the Ottoman Empire a distinct advantage. So the soldiers of the Safavid army being trained to use artillery. And one other major reform that really in a very, very overt way mimics the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire, they create this new kind of elite fighting force known as the Ghulams. And it works exactly the same way as the Ottoman Janissaries, where you have these slaves who are conscripted during their youth from Christian families, primarily Armenian, Georgian, and Circassian families. And so, converted to Islam. And then if they show a proclivity for kind of military activities, would have been trained to become part of this elite fighting force, right? So, same basic deal that you had with the Janissaries. And as we can see, under Abbas I, the Safavid Empire is going to become quite large. So, definitely the kind of what we might call imperial heartland, roughly corresponding to modern-day Iran, and that's at the center of this map here. But also frequently conquering territory in roughly what corresponds to modern-day Iraq. That actually goes a long way to explaining why a large number of Arabs in Iraq are Shiite, and also conquering territory in Central Asia. And even until now, you see evidence of Iranian cultural influence in that part of the world. After Abbas I, it's kind of downhill from that point forward, in part because of two expanding empires to the north and south of the Safavids. So to the north, you have the Russian Empire, which is beginning to conquer territory in Central Asia. So these kind of correspond to the modern states of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the stans, right? Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and so forth. And so, kind of falling out of the Iranian sphere of influence and into the Russian one. And of course, if you go to these places today, sometimes the Russian cultural influence has somewhat obscured this much more ancient Iranian one. So, for instance, Russian would be a much more common second language in these countries. Coming from the south, we have the Mughal Empire being established in India. That's expanding northward at the expense of the Safavids to some degree. And then after that, it's going to be the British Empire in India. And so the Safavids and then subsequent dynasties, we might just say Iran, eventually becoming you know, kind of the meat within a sandwich, being squeezed from the north by the Russians and from the south by the British. But by then, we in fact have a new dynasty in Iran, and that would be the Qajar dynasty beginning in 1785, running up through 1925. That's a pretty good cutoff point with respect to this lecture. Certainly bringing us up to definitely deep into kind of the modern period, and in some ways kind of the last dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, running up until the Iranian Revolution. Probably it should be noted that it is under the Qajar that the what is the present-day capital of Iran is established in Tehran. At that time, a small village, but of course now one of the largest cities in Iran. And at this point, we move over to look at developments in India, where we see the establishment of a Muslim-based empire, the Mughals. And this kind of starts with the, you could call it kind of invasion of India or expansion of the Islamic world, Islamic civilization into India under a fellow named Babur in 1527-27. And so he is actually in some ways a successor of a Mongol-based dynasty that eventually had converted to Islam. The Timurid, coming from the Timurid dynasty, but now founding a new dynasty, the Mughal dynasty in India. So he marched into India and basically defeated the last Sultan of Delhi. And also defeating a Rajput confederacy, bringing that territory under his rule, and by his death had established his rule over most of the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. And in fact, I should note the term Mughal actually referring to the Mongol origins of this dynasty. There we see Babur depicted artistically to the right. Probably considered to be the greatest of the Mughal rulers would be Akbar the Great, who reigned between 1556 and 1605. You know, certainly great in the sense of expanding the empire, conquering additional territories, but also initiating some very important governmental reforms, both at the center of government, but also at the provincial level. And so this is going to make for much more effective government. This includes also rationalizing the tax system, meaning more revenue, allowing the government to more effectively control its territory. But more importantly, perhaps, someone who genuinely cared about the welfare of his subjects. And so, you know, considered to be very just, very fair, and actually very effective as a ruler. And initiating what will be kind of a defining practice of the Mughal Empire, at least for the time being, which is that they are highly tolerant religiously. No small thing, given that the vast majority of their subjects are Hindu, they're non-Muslim. And eventually you will see a fair number of individuals converting, such that by the time we get to the 20th century, Muslims make up a sizable portion of the population of the Indian subcontinent, particularly if we're including Pakistan. You know, bearing in mind that Pakistan was part of India up through the end of its colonial rule by the British. But even if we only think about the modern day state of India, not including Pakistan, also Bangladesh, India has more Muslims than any other country on earth. They still constitute a minority of that population. It's just that India has so many people, right? But coming back to the time of Akbar the Great, initiating this kind of policy of religious toleration, something demonstrated, for instance, in his marriage to Rajput princesses, but more importantly, the appointment of Hindus to positions of power. And all of this did a great deal to ease Muslim-Hindu relations. He also canceled the poll tax required of non-Muslims. So the general attitude of Islamic governments to non-Muslim populations was that so long as they were monotheistic, and you know, up until this point, primarily encountering peoples of monotheistic faiths, Jews, Christians, even Zoroastrians in the case of Iran, who, you know, it's not too hard to define them as being monotheistic. The idea is that so long as you paid this special poll tax, you were pretty much allowed to manage your own affairs. But obviously, canceling that poll tax would be very beneficial. We should note that through some creative thinking, the majority of the ulama, or religious authority within Islam, had kind of decided that Hindus are in effect in some fashion monotheistic. Again, does require a bit of creative thinking. Idea that yes, they have many gods and goddesses, but they are all manifestations of a single Godhead. So this is actually going to, again, prove very beneficial to the Hindu population. At the same time, Akbar the Great is going to work very hard to sideline some of the hardliners among the ulama, who might have wanted to take a harder tact in dealing with the Hindu population. And finally, he actually tried to promote communication and dialogue between representatives of the different religions, not just Islam and Hinduism, but other religions such as one might encounter in India, frequently bringing together respective religious authorities to discuss matters of faith, kind of seeking out of common ground. Now, we should note that this period of Mughal rule is going to see a lot of construction projects, of really beautiful palaces, mosques, and so forth. We might start with the palace complex located outside the Mughal capital of Agra, Fatehpur Sikri, which from these images here is obviously very beautiful. We also are kind of seeing the emergence of a new style of architecture that is, Islamic, but also represents certain indigenous traditions of architecture that are now being incorporated into the final product. And again, this is a period of tremendous Mughal territorial expansion. A lot of this happening under Akbar the Great, what we see here color-coded in yellow, but then continuing under his successors, particularly Aurangzeb, a little bit down the line, what we see color-coded here in orange. So in sum, a golden age of Mughal culture, particularly in architecture, but also painting, and a lot of this reflecting a fusion of traditional Hindu and from the Islamic side, Persian influences. The one negative development during this period, and some of this ties in with the territorial expansion, too much being spent on military campaigns, also building construction, with the military campaigns. So this kind of setting up problems for down the road. And finally, we should note that if we're talking about beautiful buildings that are being constructed during this period, probably none are more famous than the Taj Mahal, which is constructed under the Shah Jahan. And this is not a mosque, by the way. This is actually a tomb for his beloved wife. But surely probably one of the most famous buildings, not just in India, but in the entire world. And that finally brings us to Aurangzeb, who reigned between 1658 and 1707, the son of Shah Jahan. And this is kind of where things are going to really dramatically change, most notably with respect to religious toleration. Aurangzeb, very famously religiously intolerant, is going to persecute non-Muslims, the vast majority of which are Hindu. That will entail, for instance, the destruction of Hindu temples and, of course, reimposing the poll tax. And then, innocently enough, I suppose, against this backdrop, we see the arrival of the English. Initially, as simply a trading post in Gujarat, and they're not the only European power doing that. But then, particularly in connection with the 7 Years' War, eventually the English becoming the dominant European power there, and eventually taking over the entire subcontinent. That isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time. In the meantime, we might consider other developments. The emergence, for instance, of other religious communities. Probably the most important would be the Sikhs, who are neither Hindu nor Muslim, but in fact combine elements of both. They trace their origins to the teachings of Guru Nanak, who died in 1538, but eventually become a substantial community in some parts of India. Now, what's interesting about them, they actually are pretty open-minded about other religions. They oppose narrow allegiance to any particular creed. They preach faith and devotion to one loving, merciful God. Nonetheless, they will be persecuted by Aurangzeb. in response to which they develop a military force that will eventually go on to initiate repeated uprisings. So they become actually a bit of a problem for the Mughals. Just as a kind of aside, we have sizable Sikh communities in the United States who, unfortunately, whenever you have a kind of episode of Islamophobia or a kind of anti-Islamic sentiment being directed violently at Muslim communities, often Sikhs get mistaken in those episodes for being Muslims, partly because they very famously, very often sport rather large turbans, which actually has nothing to do with Islam, but I suppose for people ignorant enough to engage in Islamophobic sentiment, probably not making those kind of distinctions too quickly. And of course, Hinduism will nonetheless prevail as the majority religion in most parts of India, even if not often holding political power, but that isn't always the case, particularly in the south, where we see the emergence of the Hindu Marathas, who establish a regional empire beginning around 1646. Partly because they're able to build an extremely disciplined army. And then following Aurangzeb's death, they establish a confederation of Deccan states, more or less in the south, even if from 1740 onward acknowledging the overlordship of the Mughals, but nonetheless actually controlling more Indian territory. And by the way, this also kind of corresponds to a kind of demographic division that's beginning to take shape, where certain parts of India are going to end up being Muslim majority, other parts Hindu majority. And in some ways, kind of anticipating after independence from British control, colonial control, the partition of the Indian subcontinent into two separate states. What today we know as the modern state of India, but also Pakistan, which initially included what today is known as Bangladesh, at that time referred to as East Pakistan. In the meantime, the British becoming an ever more pervasive presence in India. And eventually, of course, I think most of us realize they're going to take over the subcontinent entirely. That won't happen overnight. In the meantime, we see the emergence of various other kingdoms that are threatening Mughal dominance. Probably most prominent would be the Islamic State of Hyderabad, but also we're seeing invasions by Afghan tribal elements, probably most famously that headed up by the Afghan tribal leader Ahmad Shah Durrani, who will go on to found the modern state of Afghanistan with British support. But eventually, the British East India Company is going to become the greatest threat to the Mughals and pretty much all Indian kingdoms. And by 1819, effectively coming to dominate the Indian subcontinent. That is a story we will pick up later when we look at European imperialism and colonialism more broadly. In the meantime, I'd like to consider some kind of more religious or spiritual developments, probably the most important of which is the emergence of a movement known as Bhakti. It's a kind of spiritual or mystical movement oriented towards piety or ethical behavior. And we're going to see manifestations of it both in Islam, primarily through Sufism, which is a kind of movement that developed in Islam actually a few centuries earlier, and by this point quite prevalent in the Middle East, but also in Hinduism. Probably Sufism is more famous in this regard, and by 1500 you have many Sufi retreat centers throughout the Indian subcontinent. So the deal with Sufism is, kind of the idea that by engaging in certain practices, probably the most famous is twirling in place, as per whirling dervishes. Some of you might be familiar with this image. But in a sense, you're trying to achieve a kind of trance-like state by which you're able to negate your own ego and achieve union with God. Related to this, a tendency to play down external forms of piety. For instance, things like associated with the 5 pillars of Islam, like praying 5 times a day or fasting during Ramadan. Kind of the idea that if you're able to achieve union with God, you really don't need to engage in these kind of practices. And as you might imagine, this would be very upsetting for the religious authority in Islam, the ulama, though eventually in most places finding a kind of middle ground wherein, rather than replacing the more conservative forms of religious practice, this is something you do in addition to them. Now, in the case of Hinduism, bhakti will lead to a kind of revival, right? So it represents a kind of devotional practice epitomized by the Bengali Krishna devotee Chaitanya, who stressed devotion to Lord Krishna. And maybe some of you who are well traveled, though I think this isn't as common as it used to be, right? It used to be very common if you were in an airport, you would likely encounter devotees of Hare Krishna. Lord Krishna, right? And this is actually the origin of that kind of movement. Among other things, they rejected the caste system and really stressed the equality of all in God's sight. And so, as you might imagine, this manifestation of Hinduism would actually probably be especially appealing to individuals not coming from India, people in Europe or the United States who are perhaps drawn to Hinduism, but put off by some of the kind of social elements that we associate with it. In the meantime, Islam continuing to spread, among other places, to Central Asia. We should be clear we're talking about Sunni Islam. And primarily this is happening in a rather organic fashion, mostly traveling with Sufis, traders, tribal rulers, just bringing it with them to the different parts of Central Asia that they end up going to. One exception in this regard is going to be Mongolia, which is converted to Buddhism largely because of its connections with China. We should note that in some ways Central Asia will be cut off from the rest of the Sunni world, in large part because of the fact that Iran is predominantly Shiite. So that kind of acts as a barrier with respect to the Middle East. So within Central Asia, a number of highlights. We should probably note the developments in connection with a people known as Uzbeks. Here the political elite dominated by a Mongol clan whose leader claims to be descended from Genghis Khan, who eventually invades Transoxiana and establishes an Uzbek Islamic empire based there. And this is the mosque in Samarkand, very famous. And what's kind of interesting, even though they are by all measure Sunni, there will be cultural influence in connection with its proximity to Iran, to some degree falling within the sphere of influence of the Safavid Empire, but then later being drawn into the sphere of influence of the Russians and then becoming part of the Russian Empire, later on part of the Soviet Union. And if we're talking about developments in Central Asia, we should also make mention of the Chagatais, who claim to be the successors of Genghis Khan, initially based in the region between the Aral Sea, Oxus River, and China, but then eventually, following a period of invasion, establishing a Chagatai state in eastern Turkestan from 1514 onward. Again, a predominantly Sunni Muslim state. And then finally, we might conclude with the spread of Islam into Southeast Asia. A lot of this really coming through Muslim traders who become very dominant in the trade across the Indian Ocean and come to constitute a very important economic and social elite in ports all the way from Africa to Southeast Asia. And they really become the mechanism by which Islam spreads. A process, though, which does become accelerated in Indonesia and East Africa by the creation of a number of Muslim coastal states. And by the way, a lot of the stories connected with Sinbad the Sailor really kind of corresponding to this particular aspect of kind of Islamic influence in the Indian Ocean, right? So here we have a map kind of illustrating the spread of Islam in Southeast Asia. And of course, eventually Indonesia will become a Muslim majority state. In fact, it is the most populous Muslim majority state in the world today. Finally, we might wrap things up by noting that by the 15th century, a number of rather important Islamic states are going to emerge in Southeast Asia, generally around trading ports, for instance, on the Malay Peninsula, the northern shores of Sumatra and Java, and the Moluccas Islands. Probably the most powerful of these would be the Islamic state of Aceh in northwestern Sumatra. And a lot of their power is derived of their ability to dominate trade. So Aceh will thrive to some degree because of its ability to dominate the Sumatran pepper trade, at least until around 1600, at which point we're going to start to see a growing European presence, starting with the Portuguese. In Southeast Asia, the Dutch are actually going to become a very dominant presence, eventually creating the colony of Indonesia by basically linking together all these different territories, islands, peninsulas, and so forth. That will become the basis for the modern state of Indonesia, but it is interesting to consider that up until that point, well, even until today, consisting of a very broad diversity of different ethnic and linguistic groups that up until that point did not see themselves as constituting a single kind of national identity. In any event, this is a good place to stop. We're going to return to Europe very shortly, but eventually we will pick up in this part of the world when we start to address European imperialism and colonialism in the 19th century. So that marks the end of this lecture. As usual, please remember to do the lecture-based questions.